Hi, everyone. It's Arundhati, and welcome to another episode of the Let's Talk Yoga podcast. I hope you are enjoying summer wherever you are. I wanted to give you a quick heads up. Starting next week, I will be traveling for about 3 weeks. You will still get an episode every week. In fact, I'm going to be rerunning some of our most popular episodes, which I believe you will get a lot of value from. And in August, we celebrate 4 years of this podcast. So there's a lot of content that we have created. So I want to bring some of that back and put it right on top of the podcast list for you. So, and once I'm back, we will resume podcasting with new episodes as usual. On the show today, we're having an in-depth conversation about social media and yoga. And I know some of you are in love with social media, some of you do not like it and you're not on it. But I want you to keep an open mind because I have Daniel Simpson on the show today, and he is the author of Truth of Yoga. That's an accessible guide to yoga history and philosophy. He teaches yoga and related topics at the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies. And in his previous career, he actually used to be a foreign correspondent with Reuters and the New York Times. And these days, he's using all those interview skills to host his own podcast called Ancient Futures. In fact, I recently heard an episode on Ancient Futures. I was looking at another guest and I came across that episode. But I did not put the two and two together until this morning. So Daniel and I are talking about not just the pros and cons of social media. That I think is very simplistic. And most of us already know that. But we're looking at what are the effects of consuming yoga on social media, short form content learning versus long form content, and how to have better ability to discern and critically think and understanding your own goals and how to use the medium to meet those goals. And more importantly, how to measure success in yoga or a success in your studies, right? And is that bearing fruit? So we go through all these layers in this conversation. It is something that you should listen to if you are on social media, if you are not, or if you're one of those teachers who told me that you've shut social media because it's too distracting. I believe it comes down to striking a healthy balance of how we interact with the world of technology and our yoga in that process. So I'm really excited to bring you this episode. As always, I hope the content we put up here is valuable to you. And if it is, please remember to rate, review, subscribe, and share this episode with at least one other yoga friend. I've told you before how that is what moves the needle for us. We are on every podcasting platform, including Audible. So if you are on those platforms, it would mean the world to us if you could leave us a review and share this with other people. Let's get on with today's show. Hi, Daniel. Welcome to the Let's Talk Yoga podcast.
Well, it's a pleasure to meet you. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, I'm happy to have you here because you and I are going to talk about yoga and social media. I feel like it's one of those topics that usually people will avoid or they have very strong feelings towards it. And like I was mentioning before we started recording, it can be a beast or your best friend. Personally, I think I've struck a wonderful balance with it on most days, but it is still a tug of war in many ways with the medium. And something I've been thinking about ever since, this conversation, we decided to have it, is learning yoga is one thing, right? And consuming yoga is a separate experience altogether. And I personally feel like on this digital medium, social media, Instagram, I mean, we connected on Instagram. Everybody's consuming yoga, but also think they're learning yoga. So it's confusing, for me at least. What are your thoughts on someone who's worked with long form yoga studies and content for so long? What do you see happening to yoga?
Wow, that's a big question. I suppose we have to start by defining yoga. If I get too scholarly about it, that's where we'll always have to go because, so many things come under that umbrella. And I think social media blurs so many of those boundaries because, as you say, I mean, yeah, let's be honest. Most yoga teachers who are posting on social media are marketing. So it's, content-based advertising for their products and services. And yoga is taking place in a capitalist context, and people are asking for money in return for what they offer. And that's very different to the historical background of how yoga was transmitted. The actual, I guess information is also different because the practices that most people are encountering these days, sequences of postures in groups in a classroom on, these yoga mats. I mean, that's all stuff from the 20th century, pretty much. I mean, some of the components are very old indeed, but the combination into that package that's put together as something for the stressed out urban consumer, that's very new. And I think a lot of the time, we are afraid of talking about that stuff because it puts us onto thin ice and we start to worry, are we going to be accused of being inauthentic, even worse, appropriative and colonizing if white Western yoga teachers? And, I think everybody would rather just sort of say, I teach yoga, therefore I am pursuing the timeless quest. And, this social media stuff I'm doing is clearly part of that. And they don't want to ask the awkward question of what would align it to a timeless quest. Am I aligned to a timeless quest? What on earth does it mean to have a timeless quest? Because I'm here right now in the 21st century, wherever I happen to be. So I think we need to start by actually asking, what are we doing under the umbrella of this thing called yoga? And therefore, how does social media fit into that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I suppose one other thing just comes to my mind straight away, which is if we were to, everyone likes to talk about Patanjali and his Yoga Sutras. If we were to summon Patanjali out of the ether and say, what's this social media stuff? Would you get on board with it? You just go to the very first sutra of the Yoga Sutra, the commentary that accompanies that, the one traditionally attributed to Vyasa. It says in there very clearly, the practice is about samadhi, and the cultivation of samadhi comes through one-pointedness of mind. So the ekagra state is what yoga is to cultivate through our practice. And then there are three other states: distraction, confusion, and agitation, which get in the way. Social media produces distraction, confusion, and agitation. Patanjali, I think, would immediately say thumbs down, no likes from me. But, okay, once we've got over that hurdle, I think there are ways it can be used that are harmonious with the spirit of yoga. It's just a question of, as I say, asking some searching questions to start with.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think as consumers, we are becoming, I'm speaking more about me, but we're becoming lazier. And we are now expecting everything to come to us in really these bite-sized 60 seconds, became 90 seconds. And now the push has gone back to 5 to 15 second bursts of, and it's really hard to condense yoga into those tiny fragments, right? And because we cannot control, it's a marketplace, right? We can't control what is being sent our way. How can we as yoga consumers be sharper at discerning, be better at critical thinking? How do we sort through the noise? Do you have any input on, this is noise, this is not useful, this is more, there's more value here for me?
You ask an excellent question, and I think it's the core of yoga practice, to be honest. I mean, discernment, viveka, for Patanjali, certainly that's the means to liberation. It's also one of the 6 preconditions for a Vedantic student. If you don't have any discernment, you're not welcome. So you've got to get that cultivated to get started, because the whole process of yoga, even if you're operating in a non-dual framework, you still have to differentiate what is the source of confusion. I mean, the whole problem of yoga, the problem that yoga is addressing, is avidya, wrong knowledge. And if you need to get the right knowledge that will set you free, you've got to be able to tell the difference. So this discernment process is absolutely integral. But in order to tell the difference between things, we have to have some idea of what we're trying to do and where we're trying to get. And I think, there's this assumption somewhere in the background, yoga is all part of this sort of same unbroken lineage. Yoga is for liberation traditionally. So in some way, if we just keep on doing what we're doing, we're vaguely in the direction of liberation. But if we actually are honest with ourselves, I don't know how many people who are teaching and practicing yoga in the 21st century even want the kind of liberation that's described in ancient texts. Might be much more comfortable talking about, an embodied freedom here and now to be a bit more skillful in our day-to-day life, much more like the language of the Bhagavad Gita than the language of Patanjali. And, as a result of that, we would need to recalibrate and think, well, what's getting in the way of my skillful action, to borrow the Gita's language? And what is it that I need, therefore, to cultivate to get, that problem dealt with? And again, that can be used as this tool for trying to assess social media. Everything does come down to, in the end, dualities, binaries, opposites. And it's not that, either extreme is really that helpful. We can always think about the perfect as well as, the imperfect. But reality is somewhere on that spectrum. And we need to be able to situate ourselves on a spectrum between helpful, unhelpful, liberating, entangling, suffering and release from suffering on the ultimate level. And for that, we need to know basically which way is up and which way is down. And so if we haven't got some kind of, this yardstick, a compass that can tell us, am I going right or left, then we're a bit lost. And it'll be different for all of us. We need our own assessment of why am I doing this practice? What am I hoping to get from it? Even just as a provisional answer for today. And then which information is going to help me to make progress towards that objective. And if my objective is really honestly to get good at handstands, then I can switch on social media and look for tips, without shame. Fine, that's what I want to do. Yeah. Best own it. And then I'll get what I'm looking for. If my aim is to remove the kleshas in my mind that are entangling me in cycles of suffering, then social media algorithms are basically, an industrialized version of the kleshas. They work on this raga dvesha binary, craving aversion, and they increase ignorance because they get us agitated. They're designed to try and trigger us into, doom scrolling our way through stuff that we hate. So there's all this kind of, production of content that's aiming to do that, to try and trigger us. That's how you go viral. And so it's either you create envy or you get people sort of looking down on you. And either of those two things are likely to be shared. If people have strong opinions, they will engage. And so, if we immediately think, well, I don't want any of that, then we're going to have to filter out a lot of social media content. But there's a way to do that, and it's simply to follow people who are sharing information that is helpful. And because there are a lot of sincere yoga teachers out there who are trying to make a living, sharing knowledge, they share some of that knowledge for free on social media. So you can log into Instagram and actually get some pointers on, why it would be quite helpful to stop looking at Instagram. And here are some things that you can actually do today to get your practice a little bit more engaged with something that's going to be helpful in terms of that bigger picture project of not being caught up in those afflicted states of mind. So it's really about our priorities, and then we can calibrate, I think.
I like how you say it's about our priorities. In my world, I always ask the student, what is your goal? Or I ask the teachers, what is your goal? And all your efforts have to align with that end goal. So like you said, if handstand is your goal, then go work towards it. But in this complex world, right, of engaging like this, there's the ego.
Yes.
Which is being fed. And then we're also fighting the popularity metric. I'm very clear on just because it's popular doesn't mean it's authentic. But not everybody is discerning like that, right? And I feel like your yoga studies, how your foundation is set, will truly help navigate this world. So how does one separate the two? What would you say are some of the qualities of, for lack of a better word, a good student? How do I cultivate those qualities for studentship?
Well, I think it's curiosity. I mean, if yoga is anything, it's an inquiry. whether we're asking questions in the way that we are now, or whether we're asking the big questions, who am I? Who's actually doing anything here? What is the point of it all? What's my purpose? Big picture questions like that obviously take us deeper, but any inquiry is helpful because it means we start from a position of not knowing. And, we can go right back to the Upanishads. They're very insightful on these sorts of topics. They're not so easy to read because in amongst the gems, there's all sorts of other things that are quite confusing. And, without some commentarial guidelines, you don't really know what you're being presented with. But one of my favorite lines, to come back to the idea of helpful, unhelpful, is from the Katha Upanishad, talking about Shreyas and Preyas, that which is, just temporarily gratifying spiritual fast food, doesn't give you long-term nutrition, and that which is ultimately beneficial. And we have to be able to tell the difference between those two things. So that's one sort of binary that comes out of the Upanishads. But an even more useful one is from the Kena Upanishad, which says if we think we know stuff, then, maybe we know a little bit, but that's where we get deluded. That's where we puff up our ego. And we start, with our tiny bit of knowledge, perhaps going around telling everybody else, listen to me, I've got some knowledge. And what the Kena says is actually, the name of the Kena is insightful in itself. By whom is what that means. And so it's always pointing back to, the absolute biggest picture question of everything. And what it's really trying to get us to do is to focus on what we don't know. And to say, you think you know something, but look at all that stuff you don't know. Keep looking at that. That's how you'll get wise. Wisdom comes from actually admitting, that it's not about grasping these little tidbits and throwing them out into the marketplace, but actually asking good questions, trying to encourage others to ask good questions for themselves, being open to being asked questions as a teacher. So, I like a student who wants to ask questions. And those questions could be really simple. If it's a sincere question, that's really helpful because it might lead to an answer that, provisionally helps make progress. But they're all provisional answers because they only work, in this particular context. They're not for everybody. It's a bit like yoga teachers and their alignment cues. Not everyone's got the same body. And so, if you haven't got a way of adjusting it to the person in front of you, then you're not going to be much of a teacher. And similarly, if you're a student, if you just think, I just have to go to the teacher and say, tell me knowledge, you're not going to get very far. So I really like it when I'm teaching, if I can just go with no notes, no slides, no plan, and ask people the questions. Because to be honest, that's the way I was taught when I went to see people in India. If you didn't have a good question, you wouldn't get a good answer. Either that or you get a 2-hour lecture, which perhaps wasn't what you were after in the first place. So, we as you say, we want to be spoon-fed, and I don't think that's very helpful.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's very helpful either. And I always was told by my teachers, if I asked them a question, they would give me 3 questions back, which would actually work for me to do, to go get my own answer. And then to come
Even
back
better.
with what I found, it was work. And I believe in the long run, it paid off. Back in the day, I probably didn't understand this learning structure that they were setting for all of us. But something I've noticed is there's a lot of echo chambers, right? People want to be right. And I can't understand where that has developed on social media. And I honestly don't care where it's developed. But it's crept into yoga, right? Like, I'm right, you're wrong. I'm okay with a healthy debate. But instead of working with the ego, we're bolstering it even more. So what would be the difference, or what's the difference between knowledge and wisdom? Because there's a ton of information out there, right? But what's the difference between these two? And how do we see it in action?
That's an excellent question. In fact, I asked that question recently. I had a Q&A for a new course I'm launching, a year-long program called The Path of Knowledge. And part of the point of asking that question was to say, it's not necessarily the case that any amount of knowledge will give us wisdom. You can stuff your head full of information and it might not make you wise. In fact, the ultimate wisdom is to let go of all of the concepts anyway. Before we reach this state, the Taittiriya Upanishad says words turn back. So, we can't hang on to any of it, really. The state that really yoga is pointing to is beyond the mind, beyond all these concepts. But skillful use of concepts is what enables us to make progress. So I think the difference between knowledge and wisdom is ultimately what we do with it. If it's just an idea, it's irrelevant. It's got to be an idea that inspires some form of action, whether that action is, in the world, or whether it, in the way we relate to people or ourselves in day-to-day activities, or if it's in yoga practice. So if we're getting inspired to see clearly what have been consistently helpful things to do over the centuries, over the millennia, then, we're on perhaps fairly firm ground to think, if I do this, this is going to help. Whereas, if we're just sort of making it up for ourselves because it seems trendy at the moment, we might find ourselves into goat yoga or whatever it may be. I saw one recently, flamingo yoga this week.
Oh, I saw that video too.
Ridiculous.
It was beyond me. I was like, and I was thinking all the impressions I'm putting in my mind.
Exactly. Yeah. My mind didn't get steady from watching that, I tell you. Yeah, I mean, so in the end, it really helps to know what has been known in the past. That's why I think it's really essential to study ancient texts. Everybody's different. We've got a different degree of interest.
Mm-hmm.
Not everybody wants to sit there and read, ancient yoga texts in the original Sanskrit, for which you might have to study for years. But, just a little bit of engagement. The Bhagavad Gita says very beautifully in the second chapter, just a little bit of this Dharma is very helpful. And it's talking there about the discipline of the Uddhi yoga, karma yoga that Krishna is teaching, how to act in the world skillfully and not get caught up in all of the chaos. So, that in itself is useful, but a little bit of any of this ancient wisdom is useful. And it means studying. It means, again, throwing away our preconceptions, not going to old texts to find, little bite-sized quotes that we can put on memes or recite at the end of our classes or, give some sort of, canned talk based on, but instead to, really marinate in what it is that has given rise to the very tradition that has spawned what we're doing now. Otherwise, we're just going to delude ourselves. We're not going to learn anything. And we're just going to impose our own preconceptions on these ancient ideas, which is what everybody does, imagining that Patanjali endorses vinyasa flow. Patanjali's got nothing to do with moving the body. He just sit still. And of course, there are things from his text that are useful that we can still embody. But, if we're going to pretend that our yoga is teaching what Patanjali teaches, we'll need to throw away the mat and stop teaching classes and go and sit in a cave.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So are you saying lived knowledge has potential to become wisdom?
Yes, I think so. Yeah. And if we don't live it, we certainly can't get wise. You can't pass on wisdom. Wisdom has to be brought into being or inhabited, embodied. It's an ephemeral thing. It's so close that we can touch it in any moment, and yet at the same time it's so elusive that we might spend years missing the point.
And I also feel like, because I have a lot of conversations with yoga teachers who are in modern day yoga studios, right? And I always say that wisdom can be silent. Your knowledge can be silent. You don't have to broadcast every thought that comes up. And opinions are not yoga, though it seems like opinions have become the definition of yoga, right? And it's not my place to morally tell someone what is right or wrong. You show them the teachings of yoga and they get to act on it. They get to decide. And to me, I don't spend that much time online, though it seems like I do. I post my things and I leave, right?
Yeah.
And because I'm very clear that Instagram is email with pictures. You do your thing and then you leave. It's not a textbook. It's not a teacher itself. So how does one add more critical thinking to what comes your way? How does one get better at just approaching this critically?
I mean, I guess for me, the thing that comes up every time I scroll through a feed is, why am I following this person? And a lot of the time I realize, it's activating me. And in some ways, the people who really trigger me, I almost like it. I can get my daily dose of, George Orwell called it in 1984, the 2-minute hate, get all that out of my system and then get on with other things. And that's not healthy. And so I've tried to get more disciplined about just unfollowing all the people who push my buttons. and my list of people I follow gets thinner as a result.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
But I'm really also just trying to engage with people who give me things to think about. And if I feel that somebody's putting some effort into what they're producing, that resonates with me, I respect that, even if it's stuff I know already. I want to support it. I often like things just because that's how the machine works, to show solidarity, and to say, yeah, great. I'm glad that, others are out there doing things that I support. Otherwise, then we all drown in the sea of all this other stuff. And, the real critical thinking for me is to keep asking, why is this person telling me this stuff? Because usually it's very simple. They want to sell us something. And if you don't want to buy what they're selling, why read the sales pitch? And often I think, the marketing trick that everyone's been taught is to delay, get this lovely story going, little sentences, line after line, get them scrolling. They're sucked in, they see themselves in it. And then before you know it, bang, sucker punch, give me your money. And if you didn't want to be doing that, don't get sucked into that trap, because the more that the marketing message gets into the head and into the bloodstream, the easier it is to confuse yourself that that's what you wanted all along, because somebody's selling it to you very effectively. So keep asking, what is somebody trying to sell me here? And there's nothing wrong with selling. As I say, we all have to make a living. And so what I try to do in my own posts, which sometimes succeed, sometimes fail, is to just really share what it is I communicate when I'm teaching. I don't give away everything I teach, but I give away a large amount of it by, over the course of the years, just putting out information that comes from what I said the evening before. And here's a picture I used in the slide. Here's something I was discussing. Go away and think about that. I try to keep it brief. I used to be a news agency journalist, so I think of it as, news in brief item, always if possible framed with a question somehow, so that I'm not telling anyone what to think. I'm like, have you thought about this? Or what do you think about that? And actually, very rarely do people engage with long comment thread debates with it. But a lot of people do seem to say, I like that you ask me questions and that you don't tell me what to think. And so I think, what I'm selling is, as I was saying earlier, inquiry, engagement with ancient texts in a way that encourages us to think for ourselves. What's going on here? How do I put this into practice? So that's kind of my thing. If that's not your thing, you won't want my social media content. But I try to be transparent. That's what I'm selling. That's what I do. I teach courses online at truthofyoga.com if you're interested. There's a huge range of people who come and do that. Some people who are basically borderline academics. Some people who are just dipping their toe in for the first time, looking at the Yoga Sutra or the Bhagavad Gita. So whatever I say is never going to satisfy everybody on that spectrum. The scholars will pick holes and say, you haven't got detailed enough. Or where did you get that idea? Where's the footnote accrediting your source? And the others will say, don't weigh us down with all that information. Just give us, a simple pithy quote, a meme rather than, a Dharma talk, so to speak.
It's academic yoga versus yoga studio yoga. That's how I see it in my head. And the people who show up at the doorsteps of academic yoga versus yoga studio yoga are different. I'm not saying one is better than the other. I'm just saying their needs, their goals, the way they consume everything is different. But I've always thought of it in two ways, Daniel. One is, are you measuring your yoga externally? What are your external markers of success versus your own internal markers of success? And having that clarity or discernment is needed. And a good yoga teacher, post, even meme or a course, they should enhance a few things. At least in my world, they should increase your ability to reflect. Right? If a teacher or a teaching is not in yoga, is not making you reflect, then maybe something's off. And eventually reflection also increases your own reverence towards yourself and your yoga. For me, that's something that I keep in mind. But if I had to simplify that, I would say clarity and confusion. They are two sides of the same coin. on social media, in life, right? And everything you're consuming, is it enhancing your clarity or is it confusing you more? I think the yogis kept it pretty straightforward, unless you go deep into the text and you got to sort through stuff. But it was meant to be lived. So to me, that's a big metric personally, right? I call it the 3 C's in many ways. If your clarity is going up, if your compassion is going up, if your contentment is going up, your yoga is working for you. And if you are just angry all the time and upset and more, you're dividing everyone and everything, then is that yoga or is it something else? Those are questions I ask myself.
They're good questions.
And so what I'm trying to get to here is how, and because you're in the academic world, right? I'm in what I call the yoga studio world. How do we measure if our yoga is working for us, if our studies are yielding fruit, if we are going on the right path? Is there any way to measure it?
Well, again, we come back to objectives, really. If we've got a sense of where we're trying to go, then it's possible to assess, how we've done. So it comes back to intention at the beginning and then attention, paying attention to whether we've embodied and, made some progress with our intention. So if we haven't set any clear intentions and we don't have any, tools for assessing through paying attention whether or not we're putting them into practice, then the whole idea is just abstract anyway. So we need to have that first of all. And that will again be personal. And, obviously from an academic point of view, I've got sort of one foot in both camps, really. Like many people involved in scholarly yoga, I'm a practitioner, really, first and foremost. Although if you really want to make it as an academic, you have to put that in the background and be more of an academic yoga person, which is why I didn't go that far with it. Instead, what I've really tried to do is to interpret what I learn from people who know more than me in a way that's accessible to the curious, yoga practitioner who wants to know more than they get from often what is, to be honest, misleading popular yoga in the marketplace. And sometimes confusion is the first necessary step to clarity, because we have to say, well, you've been told things that are misleading and they're not helpful, and they're not going to help you make progress. So sometimes the first marker of progress is thinking you're going backwards, because actually, to be on a firm foundation, you have to pull down this kind of rickety structure that's been, cobbled together without any building permits. Once that's knocked down, then you can put together a nice solid, foundation for your long-term yoga dwelling. And so I think, it's very hard to have it in linear terms or, clear criteria that apply to everybody. And I think it's even hard to assume that yoga does anything for us that we're not actively seeking to cultivate. Because yoga can help us to pay attention for sure, but it doesn't necessarily make us good people unless we prioritize trying to be compassionate, kind, thoughtful. All those qualities are emphasized precisely because they need to be cultivated. The attention training is to see, am I actually, the Buddhist teachings are so clear in this respect because they talk about right and wrong. So you can have right view or wrong view, right intention, wrong intention, and so on all the way through the Eightfold Path. The same thing is there in the Mahabharata. There's also an eightfold, the Ashtanga Marga, they call it, the eightfold path in the same way, but it's related to other qualities for a yoga practitioner. But again, it's right this or the possibility that it isn't right. So right concentration, wrong concentration. So we have to have, again, that binary of being able to see, am I cultivating this or am I doing things that make it less likely? Just making shapes on a mat, feeling good in ourselves, does not necessarily mean that we're not going to walk out the door and shout at the first person who annoys us. We're only going to not shout at them if we start to think, actually, it's a problem if I do that. And obviously, the more we pay attention, the harder it is to ignore the fact that, hang on, by shouting at that person, I am needlessly introducing suffering into the world. I felt some suffering when this person annoyed me, but by expressing it, I passed it on. Whereas if I'm a yoga practitioner, the alchemy that I can perform in my body is to observe the arising of that tendency, and through my training and my skill to say, that doesn't affect me. Actually, I'm even-minded in the face of it, to again borrow the Gita's language, so that samatva, the evenness, the steadiness, doesn't get disturbed by those things, to the point eventually where we don't even have to think about it. But for beginners, we do have to think about it. Again, to quote from the Gita, a lovely line at the end talking about the different types of happiness in terms of the three gunas. So there's the dull-minded happiness, and then there's the sort of agitated-minded happiness, and then there's the clear-minded happiness, the sattvic happiness. It's described as that which in the beginning tastes like poison, but eventually turns into nectar. So, at the beginning, a lot of the time, it's not the way we would like it to be. Progress actually is to be able to turn the poison into nectar because we've refined our embodiment in such a way that it isn't affected by these disturbances. But that takes work and it takes intention. Otherwise, we just feel more, I think, entitled to be self-righteous, full of ourselves, condescending towards others who haven't necessarily achieved what we've achieved. And there's so much of that out there in the yoga world. We all know yoga teachers who have enormous egos. The number one criterion, if we really want to boil it down to simplicity, if it's traditional yoga in terms of trying to actually liberate us from the things that cause the cycle of suffering, it's going to diminish our attachment to a personal worldview. And this needy little, shrunken, contracted person who says, I don't like that. That's the mindset of the ego. It's the mindset of craving and aversion. It's the mindset of klesha. If we want to see, are we getting somewhere? It's whether or not, we've got the ability to let go, to not cling on to everything, to not get so, bound up in this idea that there's a person here who can be insulted. Instead, it's just impersonal. It's just stuff happens. Stuff happens to us. Gita says you can walk through your whole day that way if you're really good at it. It's just stuff happening. Food is taken. It's excreted. Sitting happens. It's just happening. There's no person involved. And obviously that's, a very high level of achievement. But again, coming back to the binary, are we getting a bit closer to that, or are we getting a bit further away from that? Simple.
It is simple to me, complex in practice, but was laid out to be actionable. That's how I see it.
Yes. Yes.
But you were talking about the two things I want to go back to. You spoke about intention. I'll get to intention in a moment, but suffering, right? Dukka, and this whole concept of dukkha nivritti. And I joke, I have a yoga studio, and sometimes we have these conversations, and I keep telling everybody, I said, you're suffering, and suffering is an opportunity. It's not an obstacle. It's an opportunity. And it's an opportunity to grow, to discover, to know more about yourself. And you could be suffering physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, karmically. But somewhere along the way, at least in Western yoga, there is this notion of yoga has to feel good. Everything is love and light, right? Good vibes only. I don't even understand what that really means. But and I always say yoga doesn't need to feel good. It needs to be effective. It doesn't need to be fun. It has to be fulfilling. So how should we relate? How do we understand this concept of dukkha?
I mean, if we break it down, it really just means the first bit is an adjective meaning bad. And the second bit can refer to, the hole in a wheel through which the axle slots. So it's a bad hole, a bad space. The opposite is sukha, which is a good equivalent space. So if you've got a bad space in your wheel, your axle will be bouncing around. You'll ride through life, just jolted around by all of the vicissitudes, as I was just describing. So I think it's just a state where we're not at ease. It's, to think of it simply as that. It can be dis-ease, as in disease. It can be unease, as in I'm uneasy, I'm, anxious. Those are things we all know very well. The modern world's, full of anxiety and disease. And yet, we've got so many advancements that should make it possible to be okay in the face of all these things. But people are getting very agitated all the time. Just look what happened in COVID. And I think the opposite of that is to be at ease. So the problem of dukkha is that our ability to be at ease is not within our power. And the practice of yoga is a way of getting some agency back, to start to say, okay, well, there is suffering. It's very clear this body will fall to pieces. It will not live forever. That's the cause of misery if we get too attached to me in this body. But if we see differently, it's not so much of a problem. We can still be at ease as the body falls to pieces. So if we take that back to a more day-to-day thing, we can be at ease in the face of other disturbances, other things that don't go the way we want them to. In fact, we can start to see that the very desire for things to go our way is the cause of the uneasiness. If we don't actually have an agenda, that's what the Gita says. That's its revolution. It says, unlike all the other early yoga texts that say, go and sit in the corner, fully nivritti, don't be involved in the world. It says, well, actually, no, you can engage in the world so long as you just disengage the mechanism in the mind that says, I want stuff. Instead, you're just completely detached from the getting of it. You maybe invest a strong intention towards the achievement of something, but whether it's successful or not is irrelevant. And that's very hard to do, obviously. But it is the way out of this problem of being dependent on external factors for our contentment. And the path of yoga leads to the possibility of just being at peace, contented, even joyful for no reason at all, other than that life is here. We are alive. We are part of this sort of unbroken stream of awareness that has animated all life. And we don't need to get too concerned about anything. Although obviously, it's very easy to say that with all of the actual much more extreme kind of suffering that's in the world. If somebody is kicking you out of your house or blowing it up, obviously it's not so easy to start thinking about these things. We're very fortunate to be able to have this conversation, thinking about the kinds of day-to-day first world problems that most of us are dealing with. But even so, people developed the capacity to do this in the extermination camps in Nazi Germany. There's a psychologist, Viktor Frankl, who very famously described it almost exactly in yogic terms. The one thing that couldn't be taken away from him was the capacity to choose his internal state, no matter the circumstances. And that's what yoga can give us. So the suffering is entirely due to the fact that we are, as the Katha Upanishad would put it, investing all of our desire for stability in the world of changing stuff that will never satisfy us in that way. But there is something else outside of that we can access inside ourselves that's okay with that. It can be with all of these things. It just is. The Katha Upanishad concludes that way. All you can say about it is asti. It is.
And I agree, it is, right? But this is where I feel like long-term study and letting, you use this word earlier, which I really like, is let it marinate, right? Let it seep in, understand it beyond just the surface level and put it invisibly into practice, sit with it in your head. For me, those are really important. Like time is such an integral time, teacher, teachings, all of it. You can't get away from it if you really want to grow your roots deep into the practice. So you mentioned intention a couple of times on this conversation.
Yeah.
I understand completely where you're going when you say intention, but what if someone doesn't know how to study yoga? Right? They walked in from a studio to online yoga. They're curious. There's so much the algorithms feeding them. How do we set an intention? What would you suggest?
Well, I think we have to come back to the problem that yoga is there to resolve, which is, knowing the wrong things and thinking that they're right. So it's really to come back to, this curiosity. So I think the number one intention that all students need is a willingness to explore and to be open. because we can't learn anything otherwise. And so that might mean, unfortunately, that we have to take wrong turnings and, find out for ourselves that we've, not perhaps made the wisest choices. That's how we learn. We learn by making mistakes, really. And it's always so tempting in this modern era to get, the perfect solution, the YouTube video that in 90 seconds can resolve all confusion and say, do this, do that, do the other, fix, whether it's making your toilet function or getting enlightened. And people want that. So, I understand that, but it won't provide lasting satisfaction. In fact, the only thing that provides lasting satisfaction in the end is wisdom. And wisdom doesn't come easily. You can't buy wisdom in the end. You can buy perhaps access to wise people. You can buy a lot of information full of wise ideas. But the ability to embody that comes from being open. And as you were saying, coming back to that marinating theme, the willingness to take time. It does not happen overnight. We want the quick fix. We want, the perfect answer. We want to have it tomorrow. We want to often understand it so that we can integrate it into our teaching offerings and, then go out there and start making money doing whatever it is. People go on trainings in order to get material that they can immediately go out and present as their knowledge. That's not your knowledge. It's just parroting. It becomes one's own knowledge when, we've really got stuck in with it. So what I often say when people are asking me on a yoga teacher training course, what can I take away from this? What can I go and teach? How do I teach yoga philosophy is often the question. Well, start by giving up on that for a few years and come back to basics. We talked about ideas. I wrote my book, The Truth of Yoga, in a way to try and help with this, breaking down, again, based on my, news agency journalist background, breaking down lots of themes from yoga traditions over the millennia into 100 short chapters, basically, none of them longer than 500 words. Yeah. But they're all very short. The books, it's only that wide. It's a couple of 100 pages. Each of them are like a blog post, and they cover, a theme. So, break down ideas from the earliest era, the Vedic time, the ascetic traditions, from different Upanishadic ideas to, whatever it may be. But I say, well, why don't you find one of those chapters that you particularly liked? And perhaps in that, there's one quote that really, resonated with you. Why don't you go away and try to theme your next year's teachings around that idea? Get to know that well. Be an expert on that. That's then going to be something that you've had to really study. Otherwise, you're not studying. You're just taking things off one shelf and then putting them on another shelf with a price tag on them. I don't think that's learning. That's just moving things around the knowledge factory in the information marketplace of 21st century capitalist consumer-driven yoga. And we shouldn't be, coming back to your original question, consuming. We should be learning. And the way we learn is to put things to the test. And if there's something that really means something to us that we can talk about based on our own experience, people might actually find that interesting and helpful. If all we do is just read out a quote, it's going to speak to them, or not at least, because it's going to sound real rather than just here's some abstract idea. And then, you're also in the unfortunate position then as the teacher who doesn't really know what they're talking about. Yeah. That when people come and ask you questions about that supposedly wise thing you said, you're going to start having a panic attack rather than thinking, sure, we can sit down and talk about this. I can offer you, as you suggested, some questions of your own to think about this question,
I like how you said, take one blog post, take one chapter and spend the year on it. I've always suggested to people that learn a little yoga and learn it really well, right? Yes. And instead of just going wide, go deep. And you just need a little bit of yoga and just get really good at that and just teach that and just be fully transparent that you're just teaching that tiny fragment and work with that. I think it also rests on people like us who call ourselves yoga educators, yoga teachers, right? We have to also set expectations accordingly. And like I tell my students on day one of these long form study programs and courses that you're not going to be a yoga teacher by the end of this. You will have more questions than answers, and that's a great spot to be in. But if your goal is to teach asana, there are provisions for that. And if you don't want to, that's fine. Study the yoga for yourself. So I think I always believe that, or hope that, we hold ourselves to a higher standard. So we raise the bar as a collective, right? And there's always going to be the other side, but it comes down to getting this more in front of people. That's how I see it. There's no real question here. I'm just droning on my own. But I want to be mindful of how late it is getting for you. Can you tell us about, you do a lot of, I know you do a long form course, right? A year-long course. And I'm yet to read your book, which is on my list of things to get to later this summer. Can you tell us about all that you do and your podcast?
Oh, thank you. Yes. I mean, I came into this as a yoga practitioner who had lots of questions that he couldn't get answered by his early asana teachers, who always used to say, go and look at Patanjali. And I would turn the pages and say, where's all the asanas? And so I started to realize that maybe what I was doing had been through a few stages more evolution from the time of Patanjali to, yoga classroom in 2004. And so I spent a lot of time in India studying with teachers who also had lots of answers that were not necessarily addressing all of my questions, because they were always saying things, that required me to spend more and more time listening to their point of view. But I was a bit naughty. I went and listened to other points of view. And then I would come back with like, hang on, these two guys are saying completely different things. How can those be, both of them, right? So it was only when I went back to university in my 40s and did a master's degree that I found a different framework, the academic framework, to help me make sense of that, to fly a helicopter really high and just see how different traditions of yoga have fitted together. There isn't one yoga. There's many different varieties of yoga. There's yoga, that's got nothing to do with what we would today call Hinduism. I mean, there were Buddhist yoga traditions, Jaina yoga traditions. There's a whole, as a result of the Mughal period in India, Islamic yoga. There's all of this crossover between Sufis and yogis. There's all that stuff. And I found that fascinating. And so what I tried to do when I wrote a book was to simplify, clarify and simplify, coming back to two of the themes we've talked about. What can we say, reasonably confidently about how yoga went from renouncing the world to people on mats in studios? And so I tried to tell that story. And as a result of doing that in my courses that I was teaching at yoga studios, on yoga teacher trainings, and at the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies, where I've been teaching now for nearly 10 years, I found I was answering the same questions again and again and again, which is why I wrote my book, The Truth of Yoga, which is a very ambitious title. It does say on the second page that there isn't one true yoga, and that's the truth we need to get down with. We need to find the truth for ourselves. I wanted to try to make this journey in a little bit easier. To read my book is not going to take you all the way with study, but it might help you to have a few handholds if you did want to explore academic yoga, or if you wanted to go into traditional yoga texts. It helps to know roughly what they say first, rather than what we think they say. So I tried to make that distinction clear. And then as a result of having written the book, I thought, well, it came out right in the start of 2021. We were in another lockdown phase here in the UK. I couldn't even go on a book tour. So I thought, well, online courses of my own that go with the book. I had a course, The Truth of Yoga, originally, which was an attempt to bring the book to life in an interactive way. And then from doing that, I thought, well, why don't I offer courses in all of the main texts that I cover in the book? So there's the Yoga Sutra, Bhagavad Gita, the Pradipika, the Upanishads, and then through the prism of sort of yoga's evolution, lots of other traditions, particularly Tantra, that's influenced Hatha Yoga, the interactions with Buddhist traditions that have shaped some of what's taught in the Mahabharata and in the Yoga Sutra. And then as a result of doing all of that, I ended up actually going back to university and teaching last year on the master's degree at SOAS in London that I'd studied almost a decade earlier. And again, I thought, there's a lot in the academic world that's good, it's useful, but it's not presented for practitioners. There's a lot of knowledge that people want, in the same way that people often do a yoga teacher training, not because they want to be a teacher, but because they want a structured way to go deeper with yoga practice. And I think a lot of people wind up in a master's program almost by mistake, because there isn't another way to get that information. And it's not that it's an error. I mean, they'll learn from it, but they'll get quickly quite disillusioned with the delivery mechanism of dense academic articles. And they're not encouraged to bring all of themselves into the study and to think about, how does this relate to my practice and what do I do with this knowledge? Instead, that's sort of discouraged. That's woolly, love and light, rainbows and unicorns, yoga speak. It's not there for the scholarly world. So what I decided to do was to take everything that I presented in that year-long course, for academic purposes, remix it for the yoga public and add on to it a whole program of inquiry that says, how can these ideas from all of the different phases of yoga's evolution relate to what we do right here, right now? And at the end of the year, find a way of putting this into a project for yourself, whether that's designing the course or workshop that a lot of people want to get from one social media post, but instead, over the course of a year, we can really find a way to refine our understanding of something that we could then take out into the world. It might be another person's desire to write a long essay and perhaps even go to university afterwards. But this is a stepping stone towards that. So it's like, my book was the first stepping stone. This is the second stepping stone. If you really want to go into academia, you could use it as the launch pad. If you don't, then this is going to give you everything that you would get from there, much more affordably, much more accessibly, with a lot more fun, to be honest.
Yeah, no, thank you. This has been a wonderful conversation. I hope the listeners get time to really figure out how they interact with academic yoga, online yoga, and social media, and define their own goals and intentions more clearly, and end up just living their yoga more fully in many ways. Thank you so much. I hope you will come back for future conversations at a later point.
That would be lovely. Yeah.
Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you again. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening. As always, you can find all the links to everything mentioned in our show notes at letstalk.yoga/listen. Please remember to rate, review, subscribe, and share this episode with a yoga friend. I will see you next week with another episode, another conversation. Until then, take care. Bye-bye.